I'm so grateful that you continue to join us for these Bible studies. One of the things that I loved about Temple Baptist Church when I came here is its emphasis upon the Word. The Scripture is our foundation. For so many years, we have gathered around the Word physically, and we are still able to gather around the Word through this social media avenue. I'm grateful to be able to share with you once again today from Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Now, that's one of my favorite verses, as it probably is one of your favorite verses in all of Scripture. It talks about how God takes care of our stuff. Now, I use that very loaded theological word, stuff, because it encompasses so much. And oh, how we have stuff. Don't we have a lot of stuff going on right now? And yet we know that our God is able to work that stuff out. That's what we see in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Remember, Paul has been talking to us and sharing with us about the benefits of being a part of his family, of knowing him, of being adopted into his family. And he comes down and he talks about how God works on our behalf. Look at that verse. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose." He says, and we know. That word there, know, means to know for a fact. There are a couple of different words that you find in the Greek language. One would talk about experience, the other fact. Here he speaks about factual knowledge. We know as a matter of fact in our life. It is a confidence that we have. Experientially, sometimes we don't know exactly what God's doing. We can't see it. Maybe our faith will falter. But even when that does, we can come back to the conviction, the confidence that we have that our God is working all things out. We know. Oh, how to have that confidence. I'll be honest with you, as we go through these days, the days we have gone through, there are a lot of things I don't know. But the one thing I do know is that God is still active and alive, and He is working all these things together. I don't know exactly how He's doing it, but I know He is doing it. That is for a fact. So that's what Paul says. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God. All things. Very comprehensive here. He says everything that comes at us, everything that we experience, all those things are worked out. Now, they don't work themselves out. God works them out. He is the one who is working all of those things out. Good, bad, difficult, whatever else, God can work all things out. He weaves it all together into His divine plan. There are some things that God permits, some difficulties, because we live in a fallen world, a sinful world. He permits certain things to happen. But yet, God takes even those things He allows, and He works them together for our good. That is His promise. When I was growing up, I had an Aunt Key. Aunt Key was one of those ladies that was old all of my life. I never could imagine her being young. And one of the things that she would do is she would knit quite a bit. And sometimes when I would go to the grocery store with my mother, or I would go maybe to Walmart with my mother, I would actually buy my Aunt Key's groceries or supplies. A lot of times my Aunt Key would want me to make sure that she would buy certain threads. And I would go and I would buy the threads that she had asked me to buy and bring them back. And I would think to myself, that's not a good looking color. I don't know what she's going to do with this. Now, I know I was younger but I was like, how is she going to use this? But when I would come back, I would give her all of this material, and she would begin to work her way. She would begin to put these things together. She would weave it together. She would knit it together. And most all the time, she would produce something that was rather nice. It even had some beauty about it. Our God can take the threads of life, and He can work it together. That's His promise to us. All things. Because He is sovereign, He is good, He has control over everything, He can work it all together. Joseph understood that in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. He looked at his brothers who had sold him into slavery. And he said to them, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. In other words, all of that was meant for his harm, God had taken and used it to bring good and to bring glory. That's the kind of God we have. In the New Testament, Paul will speak to the Philippians in chapter 2 of that letter. And Paul will tell them that he is imprisoned, but actually his imprisonment has turned out for the furtherance of the gospel, because he had been able to speak the good news of Jesus Christ to the Praetorian Guard, and the witness of Christ had been emboldened. Think of that. He's in jail, but he says it's turned out to be good. Why? Because we know that all things work together for good to those who go on loving God, to those who have been specifically called according to his purpose. Paul said even imprisonment can turn out to be good. All things can turn out to be good. Job, when you think of Job's life and all the difficulty of it, you see how so much was taken away from him. And yet, God was working in a cosmic way. Job didn't even understand the worldwide impact his story would have. All he knew was that he had lost his goods. He had lost his loved ones. He had lost so much. That's all he knew. And yet God was working through that. Now, I will tell you that it can be painful. I never underestimate the pain that Job had, and I try not to underestimate the pain that you may have or that I may have. We experience pain in this world. And sometimes we may ask, why, God? A friend of mine named Roger Sullivan was pastored for years until a tragic accident had taken the mobility of his wife and taken the life of his daughter. He ended up going into a different profession, but he was still a minister. He still would share the good news of Christ. And I've heard him say, people would say, why? Why do you think God would have done this? Why, or allowed this to happen? And you know, Roger said, even if I'd known why, I'm not sure it would have made much of a difference, because it still hurt in my life. The pain is still there. Sometimes we don't know why, and even if we did know why, it still hurts. But this is the certainty that he had and that we should have. That God can take all these things, even our pains, even our wounds, and he can work them together into a good, glorifying plan for our lives. We must trust that. And even as we go through the difficulties of this day, we trust that. We don't know what all is happening around us, but we know, we have confidence that God is working all things together for the good. We got to believe that. We've got to trust it. That's what Paul says. I want to close by sharing a poem that I found some years ago. And it goes back to that idea I was mentioning a moment ago, how God is able to weave all these things together. This is a poem that was given. It's called The Loom of the Weaver. It says, man's life is laid in the loom of time, to pattern he does not see, while the weavers work and the shuttles fly till the dawn of eternity. Some shuttles are filled with silver threads and some with threads of gold, while often but the darker hues are all that they may hold. But the weaver watches with skillful eye each shuttle fly to and fro, and sees the pattern so deftly wrought as the loom moves sure and slow. God surely planned the pattern. Each thread, the dark and fair, is chosen by his master's skill and placed in the web with care. He knows only its beauty and guides the shuttles which hold the threads so unattractive as well as the threads of gold. Not till each loom is silent and the shuttles cease to fly shall God reveal the pattern and explain the reason why. The dark threads were as needful in the weaver's skillful hand as the threads of gold and silver for the pattern which he planned. God works all things together and he weaves it together. And he is weaving each piece of fabric in your life together right now, each thread, for your good and for his glory. Know it with me, believe it, and trust it as we look to him.